Henry VIII is remembered today as the notorious Tudor King of England who had 6 wives, and 2 of these would lose their heads inside of the Tower of London. But Henry VIII's final wife was Catherine Parr, who many believed nursed the king in his final moments before he died. However, Catherine was a woman who, despite being a survivor, could very easily have experienced execution herself. She came close to losing her head or being burned at the stake as a heretic for being too radical in her religious beliefs. But following Henry's death, Catherine Parr scandalously married quickly. But following giving birth to a daughter, she succumbed to death herself, and she was buried closely to the rooms where she passed away inside of the walls of Sudeley Castle. However, her coffin was broken into and disturbed a number of times, and what those who broke into her remains did was shocking and harrowing. Catherine Parr was believed at the time of the Tudor period to have been a too radical Protestant, and many inside of Henry VIII's government believed she was leading the king down a path of more ruthless religious changes, and she was not the most popular woman. She was a woman who had married before, and Henry's final wife was very different to his other wives, and she was more of a scholar than a doting wife. She married Henry VIII inside of Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of July 1543, and was made the first Queen of England, who was also made the Queen of Ireland. She was the Queen up until Henry's death, and she had throughout her life even acted as the regent whilst the king was away in France. She involved herself in educating the future Elizabeth I. However, after the king's death, Catherine Parr fell in love again with Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, and he was sniffing around for more power. The pair had a long history together, and Seymour saw his opportunity to marry the new Dowager Queen as a way of getting closer to the throne. His brother Edward Seymour was made the Lord Protector of Edward VI and the chair of the boy king's Regency Council, and Thomas Seymour was very jealous about this. Edward Seymour was now acting almost as a king. However, Catherine Parr and Thomas married in secret, but when the information about this came to light, there was a huge scandal. Catherine's actions in accepting marriage so shortly after Henry's death were seen as shameful and disgraceful, and Edward VI was not impressed with this, and Catherine then joined forces with her new husband to take on Edward Seymour. However, despite never being pregnant before or having any children, she became pregnant with Seymour's child, and at the time childbirth during the 16th century was incredibly risky. It could be a death sentence for a woman, and Catherine's risk was heightened as she was slightly older. Complications could have been fatal. At the time, she was living inside her husband's castle, Sudeley, and she continued to help educate Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, whilst being pregnant. But then she entered her bedchambers to give birth to a daughter, who arrived on the 30th of August 1548. But Catherine Parr never recovered from childbirth, and on the 5th of September she died inside of her rooms days after giving birth. After her death, Thomas Seymour left his castle, and the funeral was arranged, and it would become historic, as it was the first fully Protestant service to occur across England. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, and Catherine's body was embalmed inside of her bedroom by physicians, and it was then taken inside of the chapel, St Mary's Chapel, next to the castle, and she was prepared for burial. She was to be buried in a huge ornate tomb that was made for her, and was then placed on the north side of the chapel, and on this tomb was an effigy of Catherine, and it had a Latin inscription on the bottom of it. However, Catherine Parr's remains were disturbed many times over the following years, and her coffin was shockingly broken into. In 1642, the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife was destroyed during the English Civil War as Roundhead forces of Parliament's army smashed up the chapel and desecrated her monument as she stood for monarchy. However, her body was also disturbed, and the grave was smashed to pieces and dug up, and it was said that there is in the castle a godly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments. However, in 1782, a number of people arrived at Sudeley, and a group of ladies who had an interest in history wanted to find the remains and tomb of Catherine Parr. Inside of the chapel, they found a block of alabaster marble in the north wall from her tomb, and some men dug underneath it, and they came across the lead-lined coffin of Henry VIII's sixth wife. These group of people then opened the coffin, and what they found was remarkable. They found Catherine Parr's body wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, a heavy wax dipped in cloth which had been almost mummifying her to preserve her. They saw her face for the first time in 2 centuries. However, as her corpse was exposed to the air for the first time, the colour of Catherine's face drained, and her eyes turned a different colour, and lost their sparkle. The women then asked the men, after their curious outing, to rebury her body inside of the coffin. But a local farmer found out about what had happened inside of the church nearby, and he tried to inspect the body of Henry VIII's sixth wife himself. It was said that, in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Q.K. Parr lay interred was removed at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more. Her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas of the Curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased. But to his great surprise, he found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, and the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said that the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from her cloth and dress which was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that the shoes were on the feet which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine Parr was yet again opened. This time it was a curious local priest who wanted to see the state of her body, and he had found that the head of Catherine had totally decayed, and presumably no skin was left. He also found that teeth had fallen out of her mouth, or may have been pulled out by those hungry to take a souvenir of the wife of Henry VIII. However, he also found when inspecting the remains that her hands and arm had turned brown, and he made a short sketch of what he saw in her body. He then covered up the body, but 6 years later, one of the most shocking parts of Catherine's desecration occurred. A group of drunk vandals entered the chapel, and they then disinterred Catherine Parr out of the coffin and messed around with it, and one man even danced with the corpse of Catherine Parr. They then dumped the body of her in the corner in a pile, making off with some more teeth, and one man allegedly even stabbed an iron bar through the torso of Henry VIII's final queen, and then had buried this in the ground upside down. Hearing of this, a local priest then appealed to Queen Victoria to give Catherine Parr a better and deserved burial in a final monument where she could finally be laid to rest after centuries of desecration. It was agreed that Catherine would be buried inside of a new coffin and a new tomb which was made from stone, and she was interred in safety. When the time came to rebury her inside of the newly renovated church within the grounds of the castle where she died, it was found that Catherine's body was just a pile of bones now, with a smaller part of flesh and hair on her body. But she was then buried inside of this new tomb where she still lies today, in decency. The horrific story of those people who opened the coffin of Catherine Parr were a mix of criminals and curious, and she was in death not given the respect that she deserved, but she is a woman who is considered a survivor of the brutal reign of Henry VIII, but she could have experienced execution herself. But what happened to her coffin over the centuries was shocking and barbaric. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.